I did not intend to teach Pāḷi, but later I thought it might be good for participants know how to read Pāļi. Pāļi is the secret language of Theravada Buddhism, and we believe that the teachings of the Buddha was given in this language, or at least the teachings of the Buddha were recorded in this language. So it is important that if you are interested in Theravada Buddhism, then you need to have at least a little knowledge of Pāļi. Now, the Pāļi language is an ancient language. It is very close to Sanskrit. We can say that Pāļi is a sister language of Sanskrit. So, many letters are the same as in Sanskrit. In Pāļi language, there are 41 letters, 8 vowels and 33 consonants. Vowels are those that make pronunciation of consonants possible. Consonants by themselves cannot be distinctly pronounced, so we have to add a vowel so that it can be pronounced. Now there are 8 vowels, and as you see on the screen, A, E, U, E, and O. The bar above the letters A, I, and U indicates that they are wrong. So A without the bar above it is a short vowel. We pronounce it as A. And the A with the bar above it is pronounced A. The duration is about twice that of the short A. And then the English letter I, and it is always pronounced E in Pāļi. And the letter I with the bar above is long E, and so it is pronounced E. And the U is always pronounced U, not as U in the word but. And the U with the bar above is the long vowel of U, and so it is pronounced U. The last 2 are long vowels. Actually, they are a combination of 2 vowels, and they are called diphthongs. So the first one is pronounced A, and the last one pronounced O. So you are familiar with saying Namo Tassa Bhagavato and so on. So these are 8 vowels. The 3 are short vowels and the 5 long vowels. 3 short vowels are A, E, and U, and the long vowels are A, E, U, E, and O. And there are 33 consonants. When you pronounce the vowel, there is no contact of the different parts of the mouth, the tongue and the wall of the palate. They do not touch each other. So A, E, and so on. It seems to come out right from the throat. But when you pronounce a consonant, then some parts of the mouth touch each other. So the consonants are divided into groups and non-groups. first 5 are called group letters because they are formed into groups, and the first line is called Ka group. So K, KH, G, GH, and N with a dot above it. So K is pronounced Ka, and KH, Ka. The H is put there for aspiration. So KH is actually the aspirated sound of K. Ka, Ha. And then G is pronounced always Ka, and never Ja, like in English word in general. So it is always Ka. And GH is the aspirate of G, so Ha. And the last one with the dot above it is Nga. We Asians have no difficulty in pronouncing Nga. But with Western people, it is a stumbling block for them. So the first 5 letters we say Ka, Ka, Ga, Gha, Nga. In actual practice, we tend to ignore the H after G. So when you say Sanghang Saranang Gacchami, you should say Sanghang, not Sanghang. And KH and GH are single consonants in Pāļi. Although there are 2 English letters, KH and GH, in Pāļi they are just 1 letter, not 2 letters. And the second group is called Cha group. In Pāļi, C is pronounced Cha, not as K, not as Ka. So C is pronounced Cha and CH pronounced Cha. And J pronounced Ja, JH, Ja. Then N with a wavy line above it is Nya. So Ja, Cha, Ja, Ja, Nya. And the third line is, you see the dot beneath the letter. So that means when you pronounce these letters, the place close to the tip of the tongue touches the heart palate of the mouth. Not the tip of the tongue, but a place a little back of the tip of the tongue. So when you pronounce these, you try to put the tongue a little back. Ta, 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 ja, ja, and na. And then the fourth group is ta, 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 na. Now, when you pronounce these 5 letters, the tip of the tongue must touch the upper ridge of the teeth. So it is ta actually. Ta, ha, da, dha, na. And the last low is pa, ha, ba, bha, ma. They are called labials because your lips touch when these are pronounced. So these 25 consonants are called group letters. Ka group, Ja group, Ta group, Ta group, and Pa group. Actually, K, KH, and so on are real consonants, but since we cannot pronounce consonants alone, we put the sound A with these consonants, and so we pronounce Ka, Ta, Ga, 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 and so on. Now, the remaining 8 letters are called non-group letters. we have no group actually. So Y is pronounced Ya, and R pronounced like an English R, and L like an English, and V. Now V is said to be pronounced with the upper teeth touching the lower lip. So the English V is correct. But in actual practice, we pronounce it as though it were a W. So you say Vipassana instead of saying Vipassana. And S is just as an English S, H as an English, and then L with a dot beneath it. So that means when you pronounce this L, you are the place just behind the tip of the tongue, such as the heart palate. So this belongs to the group with the dot beneath them, that is ta, 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 ta. And then the last one, M with a dot above it. Now this is the nasal letter. It cannot stand alone. It must always stand with a vowel. So, something like that. And this M, or this last letter, is also written M with a dot beneath it, or N with a hook under it. So, the Western people are not consistent in transcribing that last letter or that last sound. So we may choose any one from the three, and I prefer the M with the dot above it, because if the dot is below M, it may confuse with those that are pronounced with the near tip of the tongue touching the heart palate. So altogether there are 33 consonants. Now among the 8 vowels, E and O are always long vowels. But when they are followed by double consonants, and they are sounded short. So M-E-T-T-A, Mitta, Mitta, not Meta. And then second one, Sitti, not Seti, Sitti. And the third one, Okkamati, not Okkamati. And the fourth one, Yottam, not Yotam. So when double consonants follow, E and O are pronounced as short vowels. It is good to know how to pronounce Pāļi words, because you will be studying the Pāļi words along with the English words as you go along this class. Okay, now we go back to Akusala. Last time we studied the Akusala Citta, unwholesome consciousness. So there you see with pleasure, with wrong view, unprompted, and so on. Now, consciousness or Citta is said to be pure. Consciousness is not wholesome or unwholesome. It is actually neutral. But when it is accompanied by unwholesome mental state, then it is called an unwholesome Citta. When it is accompanied by wholesome mental state, it is called wholesome Citta. Now, in the first Citta, pleasure, Pleasure is a mental factor. Pleasure can be either wholesome or unwholesome. But the second one, wrong view, is an unwholesome mental state. And also there are other unwholesome mental states arising with this consciousness. So this consciousness is called unwholesome consciousness. So the consciousness becomes wholesome or unwholesome depending on whether the cetasikas or whether mental factors arising together with it are wholesome or unwholesome. That is why cetasikas are compared to color and citta is compared to pure water. So when water is pure, it is pure and there's no color. But you put a red color in the water and we call it red water, and we put green color and we call it green water, and so on. So citta by itself is neither wholesome nor unwholesome. But when it comes into contact with or when it is associated with the mental factors that are unwholesome, then it is called an unwholesome citta. And when it is accompanied by wholesome mental states or mental factors, it is called wholesome citta. So last night we studied the unwholesome cittas. Now how many unwholesome cittas are there? 12. Right? How many are rooted in attachment? 8. How many in ill will? 2. And how many in delusion? 2. Okay. How many are accompanied by pleasure? 4. How many by indifference? 6. And how many by ill will? 2. Very good. Now imagine yourself as back to school, like school children. Okay. Now we will go to next section of the consciousness called the rootless consciousness. Now last night I told you that consciousness is divided into different categories according to the sphere or the realms it frequently arises in. Now, consciousness can be divided in another way. And it is, according to the books, by way of its nature. But we may call it by karmic activity. That means consciousness that produces results and consciousness that are results and consciousness that neither produces results nor the results themselves. So result producing consciousness, result consciousness, and consciousness that is neither result producing nor results themselves. Akusala citta or unwholesome consciousness are those that produce results. And in this case they produce painful results. Today we are going to study another kind of cittas or types of consciousness, and they are mostly the resultant consciousness. Now when we see something, there arises in our mind a consciousness. Actually, we see with that consciousness. So that consciousness is called I consciousness because it depends on the I for its arising. If there is no I, there can be no the eye consciousness, and we may call it seeing consciousness, but in the books it is called eye consciousness, consciousness that depends on the eye to arise. So, in order for the eye consciousness to arise, first we need the eye, and we need the thing to see. The eye means not the whole eyeball, but the sensitive parts in the eye, the material properties in the eye that are sensitive to light. So, according to medical science, it may be the retina in the eye. So that we call eye. So in order for the eye consciousness to arise, we need that eye, and also we need that is to be seen, or a visible object. So when these two come into contact, then the eye consciousness arises, or eye consciousness is produced. So that eye consciousness is called seeing consciousness. Now, we need not just the eye and the visible object. We need two more conditions for the eye consciousness to arise, and they are light and attention. Because even though we have the eyes and there is a visible object, when it is pitch dark, when there is no light, seeing consciousness will not arise. So light is one condition for eye consciousness to arise, and also attention is important. Sometimes even a big object may pass in front of us, but we may not see it. If we are not attentive, if we do not pay attention, then eye consciousness or seeing consciousness cannot arise. So for the seeing consciousness to arise, we need four conditions: the eye, the visible object, light, and attention. When these four come together, there is what we call seeing consciousness, or the eye consciousness. Now this first consciousness is called eye consciousness, and this is the result of past karma. When we see something ugly, when we see something we don't want to see, there is this eye consciousness arising in our mind. And this eye consciousness is the result of the Akusala karma we did in the past. So when we see something, let us say here, an ugly thing, it is because of our past Akusala karma that we see it. So if we understand this, we will not blame anybody. If we want to blame, we must blame our karma in the past. So, knowledge of Abhidhamma can help us to avoid unnecessary anger when we see something bad. So, when we see something bad, there is the eye consciousness, and this eye consciousness is the result of past karma, and so we alone are responsible for this seeing an ugly object. So if to blame at all, then we must blame ourselves and not the other people or not the object. So we are not to get angry with the object. So Abhidhamma can help us to keep ourselves away from unwholesome mental states arising in our mind. Now the second consciousness is called ear consciousness.
And in order for the ear consciousness to arise, we need 4 conditions again. Auditory organ, that means the ear, or sensitive material qualities, particles in the ear. And then sound, and then space, and then attention. If there is no space or no either, we will not hear the sound. So space is one condition for the ear consciousness to arise. So here, this consciousness is the result of Akusala, or result of unwholesome karma in the past, and so the object here is an ugly sound, the sound we don't like. And then the next is, the third one is called nose consciousness. That means smelling consciousness. So smelling consciousness arises when an odor comes into contact with our nose. And this particular Citta is the result of Akusala, and so in this case the smell is a bad smell. So when we have bad smell, this type of consciousness arises in our mind. And for the smelling consciousness or nose consciousness to arise, we need the nose, smell, and air, and attention. And the next one is tongue consciousness, that when we experience some taste. So for the tongue consciousness to arise, we need the gustatory organ. That means we need the tongue. There are taste buds in the tongue, and when these taste buds come into contact with some taste, then we have this consciousness called tongue consciousness. So for the tongue consciousness to arise, we need the tongue, the taste, or the food with the taste, water or moisture, and attention. And the next is body consciousness or touch consciousness. In order for this type of consciousness to arise, we need the tactile organ. That means we need the body, some parts of the body, and then something to be touched, tactile object, and the earth element, and attention. So when these 4 conditions are fulfilled, then the body consciousness arises. And since this group is the result of Akusala, the touch must be displeasurable touch, such as pain or numbness and so on. So corresponding to the 5 senses, we have these 5 types of consciousness. So these are eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose consciousness, tongue consciousness, and body consciousness. So again, eye consciousness means consciousness depending on the eye for its arising, and so on. And the 6th is called receiving consciousness. When the object is presented to the senses, first the consciousness arises that experiences that object. Smell, taste, and touch. Immediately after that moment, there comes a moment or another type of consciousness that receives that object. Now, first the object is presented and we experience it just for a very brief moment, and then there arises a type of consciousness that receives that object. Now, when we talk about these things, we have to blow up the picture maybe 1,000,000 times. As I said on the first night, thought movements can come and go billions of times in a second. So these types of consciousness last for that just 1/1000th or 1/9 of a second. So after seeing, let us say, regarding seeing, after seeing consciousness arises and disappears, there arises another consciousness that receives the object. So that is called receiving consciousness. And after receiving consciousness, there are consciousness called investigating consciousness. After receiving it, the mind investigates it. So altogether we get 7 types of consciousness. And these 7 types of consciousness are the result of unwholesome karma in the past. And these are called Ahetuka, rootless. Now, before we try to understand rootless, we must understand what are the roots. In Abhidhamma, there are 6 mental states that are called roots. 3 are unwholesome roots and another 3 beautiful or good roots. Now 3 unwholesome roots are greed, hate or hatred and delusion. In Pāḷi, lobha, dosa and moha. And 3 good roots are the opposite of these 3. So non-greed, non-hatred and non-delusion. These are called good roots. I do not say wholesome roots because both wholesome and other roots are called beautiful roots. So there are these 6 roots. Since they are the mental factors, they always arise with certain types of consciousness. But with these, actually there are 18 in this section, with these types of consciousness, none of these roots arise. So they arise without these mental factors that are called roots. Now last night, when you study the unwholesome consciousness, you find the words rooted in attachment, rooted in ill will, and rooted in delusion. That means accompanied by attachment and so on. But these today's types of consciousness are not accompanied by any one of these roots, either unwholesome roots or beautiful roots. And so they are called rootless consciousness. And since they are rootless, they are not as strong as others that have roots. So these first group consist of the 7 types of consciousness. And these 7 types of consciousness arise when we experience something we don't like. We experience the visible object, audible object, and so on. And all these types of consciousness are accompanied by what feeling? Indifferent or neutral feeling. So when we see something, when we hear something, that seeing consciousness or hearing consciousness is always accompanied by indifferent or neutral feeling. But the 5th one arises with what feeling? Painful feeling. It is called, in Pāļi, it is called dukkha. Now, in order to understand why the others are accompanied by neutral feeling, and number 5 accompanied by pain, we need to understand some material properties. Now, there are 28 material properties taught in Abhidhamma. Among them, the first 4 are called the primary elements. And the primary elements are, as you know, the element of earth, water, fire, and air. These primary elements are said to be great essentials. The elements are said to be hard. And the other material properties, like the material properties in the eye, in the ear, and so on, are called dependent material properties. They depend on the great essentials to arise and to exist. And they are said to be not hard. So let us say they are soft. The 4 great elements are hard, and the other material properties are soft. Now, when we see something, now there is the eye. Now, the eye is also a soft material property, and what we see, the visible object, is also a dependent matter, and so it is also soft. When one soft thing hits another soft thing, there is no strong impact. Since there is no strong impact, the feeling that arises with this consciousness cannot be strong feeling. So it is the neutral feeling. Now it is compared to this. You have this diagram in the handouts also. Yes, the one on the screen may not look the same as on the sheet you are distributed. Now this diagram on the screen was created just today, and it was not by a professional person. Actually, the Venerable Nandisena did it this afternoon, but it serves the purpose. The 2 yellow balls on the left represent the cotton balls. Now, when one cotton ball is hit by another cotton ball, even though it is on the anvil, the hitting cotton ball will not hit the anvil. Or even if hits the anvil, it hits very softly. So there is no strong impact. So in the same way, when you see something, what you see is soft material property, and your eye is material property. But your eye depends on the 4 essential elements, like the anvil here. So the visible object, when it strikes the eye, since both are soft material properties, there is no strong impact, and so there can be no pronounced feeling. When there is no pronounced feeling, then the feeling is neutral. Now, with regard to the number 5, touch. Now, touch means the combination of 3 great essentials: the earth element, fire element, and air element. So what we call touch or tactile object is just the combination of these 3 great essentials. So they are hard material properties. So in the diagram, they are like the hammer. So when the hammer hits the cotton ball on the anvil, it will not stop on the cotton ball, but it will take the anvil, and so there is impact. So in the same way, when the tactile object hits the tactile organ in the body, which is soft material property, it strikes at that material property and reaches the great essentials, which are like anvil here. So the impact is strong, and so here the feeling is not neutral. When it is a good or pleasant tactile object, then it is pleasure, and when it is the unpleasant object, then it is unpleasant feeling. That is why number 5 is said to be accompanied by pain, not by joy or neutral feeling. Now, this is at the moment of seeing consciousness and so on. But immediately following the seeing consciousness are receiving consciousness, investigating consciousness, and also the other types of consciousness will follow, and then comes the full experience of the object. So at that moment, when it comes to the full experience of the object, it may be accompanied by pleasure, or it may be accompanied by pain, or it may be accompanied by the neutral feeling. But at the very moment of seeing, hearing, and so on, the consciousness is always accompanied by neutral feeling, and if it is the tactile object, then it is always accompanied by painful feeling. So these 7 are called the rootless resultant consciousness of unwholesome karma. In Pāļi they are called Akusala Vipaka. Akusala Vipaka Citta. Now here, Akusala qualifies Vipaka and not Citta. So these 7 types of Citta, or these 7 types of consciousness, are the result of Akusala, are the result of bad karma in the past. But when we see something beautiful, when we see something we like to see, then the seeing consciousness arises, and again it is accompanied by indifferent feeling and so on. So when we experience something that is pleasurable, that is good, that we like, then we have these types of consciousness under Ahetuka Kusala Vipaka Citta. They are eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose consciousness, tongue consciousness, and body consciousness. Now when it comes to body consciousness, since it is the result of wholesome karma in the past, the feeling is pleasure. And in the Kusala Vipaka, or the wholesome resultant Cittas, there is one more. The number 7th, called in Pāļi is called Santirana, the investigating consciousness. Now there are 2 investigating consciousness among the resultant Cittas of Kusala. That is because And there are two kinds of objects, ordinarily desirable and very desirable. So when the object is very desirable, then the investigating consciousness is accompanied by pleasure. And if the object is just ordinarily desirable, then the investigating consciousness is accompanied by neutral feeling. So there are two types of investigating consciousness among the Cettas that are the result of wholesome karma. Now again here, when we see something beautiful, when we see something that we like to see, we can praise ourselves. Because we did something good in the past, now we see or we hear and so on, the beautiful objects or the objects we like. So, if we understand this, we understand the law of karma. Good karma produces good results and bad karma produces bad results. So when we see something good, that is the result of the good karma in the past. And when we see something bad, again, that is the result of bad karma in the past. So we alone are responsible for our pleasure or for our suffering. So there are 8 types of consciousness in this group. 7 plus just 1, which is the investigating consciousness accompanied by pleasure. So these two groups are the resultant consciousness. They are the result of past karma. Now we come to the third group, and they are called functional consciousness. Functional consciousness means these consciousness just arise and they do their function and they disappear without leaving any karmic force in the continuity of a being. And they just arise and they disappear without leaving any karmic force. And these 3 are first, 5 sense door adverting. Now it's a long name. In Pāļi also it is a long name. So 5 sense door adverting. Now, when a visible object is presented to the mind turns to that object. So that point of turning is called here 5 sense door adverting. Before the visible object strikes the mind, our mind may be on some other object. Our mind may be on the obscure object. But when a visible object comes into the avenue of our eyes, this visible object is said to strike at the sense organs. After it is stricken, the flow of the inactive thought movement stops and the mind turns to the object. That turning to the object is what we call 5 sense door adverting. Maybe, let us say, you are looking at another place and then you hear a noise and you turn to the noise. So that turn is called 5 sense door adverting because it arises with regard to 5 senses, with regard to eyes, ears, nose, tongue, and body. And this also is accompanied by indifference or neutral feeling. So this is one type of consciousness. It has no karmic power. It does not give any results. and it is not the result of any karma. Now, second one is called mind door adverting. That means when you think of something without the use of the five senses, you just think of something, then a type of consciousness arises that turns the mind to the object. So that is the mind door adverting consciousness. This mind door adverting consciousness is also not the result of any karma, and it does not give any result. And this second type of consciousness arises in five senses as well as in the mind. So when it arises in the five senses or through the five senses, it does one function. That is called determining. And when it arises through the mind door, it is a function of turning the mind to the object. You will understand more of this when you study the thought process, because it is connected with thought process. And the last one is called smile producing. But do not think that you can experience this type of consciousness. Now you are smiling, right? But you are smiling with another type of consciousness and not this type of consciousness, because this type of consciousness is peculiar to Arahant. Arahants here means both Arahants, Buddhas, and Pacceka Buddhas. So these beings or the Arahants smile with this type of consciousness. So this is called smile producing. Since it is smile producing, it is accompanied by pleasurable feeling. So these three are called rootless functional consciousness. They are rootless because they are not accompanied by any of the roots, any of the 6 roots. And they are called functional because they just arise and they disappear. They do not have any productive power. And among these three, the first two can arise both in ordinary worldlings and arahants. But the last one can arise only in the minds of arahants. Here arahants means arahants as well as the Buddhas and Pacceka Buddhas. That means those who have eradicated all mental defilements. So altogether now we have 18 rootless consciousness. 7 are the result of unwholesome karma, and 8 are the result of wholesome karma. And the 3 are not the result of any karma, and they are not karma themselves. They just arise and disappear, performing their function. The last 3 are called functional. So altogether these 18 Cettas are called rootless consciousness because they are not accompanied by any of the 6 roots. Now in Pāļi, the word hetu, the meaning of the word hetu is a cause. So if you take just Pāļi, the Ahetuka, you may misunderstand this word. Since hetu is a cause, Ahetu means no cause. So you may think that these types of consciousness arise without cause. But that is not true. So here, hetu represents what are called the roots, or in Pāļi, mula. You are familiar with the word mula. When we say lobha mula, dosa mula, and moha mula. So these types of consciousness are called Ahetuka or rootless because they are not accompanied by any of the roots. And how many roots are there? There are 6 roots. 3 are unwholesome roots, and the other 3 are called beautiful roots. And now the first group, in Pāļi they are called Akusala Vipaka, and the second group Ahetuka Kusala Vipaka. Do you have the correct name there in Pāļi? Ahetuka, yes. Ahetuka Kusala Vipaka. Now the first 7 are called just Akusala Vipaka, but the second are called Ahetuka Kusala Vipaka, not just Kusala Vipaka. They are qualified by the word Ahetuka. That is because later we will find the Kusala Vipaka that are with roots. So in order to differentiate these 8 from the resultant consciousness that are with roots, they are here qualified by the word Ahetuka, a rootless resultant consciousness. The third group is also called Ahetuka Kiriya because there are functional consciousnesses that are accompanied by hetus or roots. So to differentiate these 3 from the others that are with roots, they are called Ahetuka Kiriya. Now when we talk about these types of consciousness, we will be using these names again and again. So when we want to refer to the last 3, then we will say Ahetuka Kiriya. 3 Ahetuka Kiriya consciousness and so on. So these 18 types of consciousness are called rootless because they have no concomitant roots. And these arise when we see something, when we hear something and so on. And all these have their place in the thought processes. Now when we see something, we see the object with thought processes, not just with one type of consciousness. Actually, our mind has to go through different types of thought processes until we can say we see something or we see a man and so on. These types of consciousness taught in this section have a place in the thought processes, and when we come to thought processes, you will understand them more clearly. Here, the sequence is first turning to the object. The first and second of the last group. Turning to the object and then seeing the object, hearing the object and so on, and then accepting or receiving the object, and then investigating the object, and then determining the object. And after determining comes the full experience of the object. So we will study these different stages in the experience of the object, when we 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 experience of the object,